Okay, so the title of today's lesson is The War on Terror. And our question, and we'll have a question like this for each day, is how can the United States combat terrorism? It's not a simple question. What is terrorism? Well, it's not a simple country or a group of people. It's a malicious act. What is the purpose of terrorism? And I hope to explore that with you today. When did terrorism start? This is not something of the new millennium. Terrorism is as old, perhaps, as the history of war. It's as old, perhaps, as human interaction. And its purpose is to spread fear. And what effect can fear have? And then we must ask ourselves the question, how can we as a society combat such a terrible thing? Okay, so as we get started, this is going to be our theme for today, is the theme of terrorism.
On September 11th, 2001, Americans had their worldview shattered. Within a span of 51 minutes, jetliners piloted by al-Qaeda Islamic extremists smashed into New York City's World Trade Center and Washington, D.C.'s Pentagon. When the day ended, over 2,900 Americans were dead. Not since the British burned and sacked Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812 had America been invaded. Over the next 190 years, the continental United States, protected by two large oceans, was invulnerable from enemy attack. This assumed invulnerability gave the nation a sense of security. A sense of security that, with the end of the Cold War in 1991, was stronger than ever. For the first time in 40 years, the fear of nuclear annihilation by the Soviet Union was gone. Americans could breathe easily. The nation was at peace. This new era of ease and peace was reflected in a booming economy. The U.S. enjoyed a standard of living that was the envy of every other nation in the world. Yet, half a world away, people in the Middle East, from Afghanistan to Egypt to Saudi Arabia, experienced the worst living conditions imaginable. Famine, poverty, war, disease. The presence of American military personnel fueled a growing hatred of U.S. power and wealth. A growing hatred that would result in attacks by al-Qaeda, a nationless fanatical group of Islamic militant extremists led by the Saudi businessman Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda and bin Laden thought of America as evil. Indeed, in many Muslim countries, extremists often refer to America as the Great Satan, a country whose decadent Western ways were corrupting traditional Islamic values. American soldiers in Muslim countries, such as Saudi Arabia, were viewed as symbols of Western oppression. Al-Qaeda and bin Laden wanted the Americans and their influence out of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East altogether. To make this happen, they decided to take the war to the Americans. Symbolized by the great twin towers of the World Trade Center, America was the financial center of the world and the primary target of Islamic militant extremists. Operating from secret bases in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda had been targeting America for a decade. In 1993, militants drove a van loaded with high explosives into the parking garage of the World Trade Center in New York.
Now, a little history on terrorism. The definition of terrorism that we're going to use is the use of violence against people or property to try to force changes in societies or governments. This is in fact a very old form of warfare. One of the first documented cases of statewide terrorism was the Assyrians. Sargon the Conqueror piled the heads of his victims in front of the feet of his throne as a message to those who might rise up against him. We see this on carvings in ancient Assyria. Since the late 1960s, there have been over 14,000 terrorist attacks throughout the world that would fall under this definition. Instances such as the 1972 Summer Olympic Games in Munich, Germany. At these Olympic Games, 2 Israeli athletes were killed and 9 others were taken hostage. The 1996 Summer Olympic Games in Atlanta, Georgia, an American terrorist used an explosive to kill innocent civilians. His stated purpose was an opposition to abortion. Of the 5 terrorists in the 1972 Summer Olympic Games, all of the hostages, as well as a police officer, were killed. Prior to Al-Qaeda, there were numerous terrorist organizations operating around the world. Think of the Ku Klux Klan. Think of the Irish Republican Army. The IRA has been engaged in a war with Great Britain for decades. Britain has always had the upper hand. As a well-established nation with one of the more powerful navies, one of the more powerful militaries, working against this covert guerrilla operation. And as we learned about the Vietnamese, we know that one of the classic tactics to undermine a more powerful foe is the use of terror. The IRA has never been strong enough to defeat the Britons in conventional war, so they've resorted to the use of terror. Another example is a group known as the Shining Path. They terrorized the residents of Peru. Their purpose was to establish a communist state. So religion has not always been the motive. In the case of the IRA, they were a Catholic group fighting against Protestant Britain. In the case of the Shining Path, it was a political motive that led this group to terrorism, hoping to install a communist regime in Peru, fighting against a non-communist state. There have been numerous cases of terrorism in Africa. In fact, Al-Qaeda was not limited to Afghanistan. They are a worldwide terrorist network. In 1998, Al-Qaeda was responsible for bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania that left over 200 dead, to which they claimed responsibility.
Blast, however, did no significant structural damage. In 1998, bombings at U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania resulted in the deaths of hundreds. And in 2000, suicide bombers rammed their boat filled with high explosives into the port side of the USS Cole, killing 17 sailors. While these attacks were troubling, most Americans saw them as insignificant. happening half a world away in war zones. With our military power, we were inviolable. With our booming economy, we were too respected and strong for any serious attacks on American soil. But Al-Qaeda's Islamic militants were already planning an attack on the American people. The idea to use American jetliners to crash into high-profile buildings had first been suggested to bin Laden in 1996. 3 years later, he okayed the plan. The first of the 20 hijackers entered the country through San Diego in January 2000. 8 months later, the rest followed. Led by Egyptian-born Al-Qaeda operative Mohammed Atta, all of the hijackers were well-educated, mature men whose backgrounds did not make them stand out as anti-American. But all were Al-Qaeda recruited and trained. While the hijackers trained, learning to take off and fly planes, the United States went through a change of leadership from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush. From the liberalism of Clinton to the compassionate conservatism of Bush. Though the dot-com boom of the 90s had ended, most of the country expected President Bush to lead America through more good economic times. Then came 9/11. On that day, the attack by the Al-Qaeda hijackers shattered the peace and security of all Americans. The attack brought the hatred of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic militant extremists home to the United States. 2 planes were flown into New York City's Twin Towers. Both towers collapsed, resulting in the deaths of 2,700 people. A 3rd plane crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The western side of the Pentagon was shattered, with 184 lives lost. Further tragedy was averted when heroic passengers on the 4th plane, United Flight 93, forced the hijackers to crash the jet into a field near Shanksville, Pennsylvania. The intended target was most likely the Capitol building, where the House and Senate were in session. Americans were stunned. Their faith that America was a safe haven from attack shaken. The country had to reclaim the assumed security it had enjoyed for nearly 2 centuries. The U.S. government stood resolute and answered.
Now, you may ask why. You may ask how these things are done. First, let's talk about methods. How might a group dedicated to spreading terror around the world achieve their goal? Well, number one, we find terrorist acts at high-profile events or crowded places where people normally feel safe. If a terrorist can disrupt a group of people's feeling of safety, they can achieve their goal. Because we know from our definition, the goal of terrorism is to spread fear. And so, popular targets of terrorist attacks have been subway stations, bus stops, restaurants, and even shopping malls. How do you avoid these places? You don't, unless you isolate yourself. And that's the goal. The purpose of this is to gain the most attention and to achieve the highest level of intimidation possible. What sorts of weapons might terrorists use to achieve this goal? Bullets and bombs are the main weapons. Think of the Paris attacks, where explosives as well as assault weapons were used in a coordinated strike against citizens of that city. Some groups have even used biological or chemical weapons. One group worth pointing out is Shinrikyo. It was a Japanese religious cult. In 1995, members of this cult released a sarin gas, which is a deadly nerve gas, in subway stations in Tokyo. 12 were left dead as a result. Thousands were among the injured. Now, this has led to a concern for the use of weapons of mass destruction. The scary thing about these types of weapons is they are relatively easy to acquire, and they are relatively easy to disperse. Okay, so next we have to examine why might groups like this commit terrorist acts. Some traditional motives might include the gaining of independence. And remember, history is told by the victor. If you've seen the movie Patriot, Mel Gibson's the hero, right? Waving the American flag and the patriotic music and the good feelings and it gives you the good feels. Well, what was his group doing? They were engaged in subversive operations against a more powerful enemy. Ergo, terrorism. They were using fear to convince their enemy the war was unwinnable. When the story is told by Americans, patriotism, guerrilla warfare. When the story is told by enemies, these are more nefarious acts. Another motive might be expelling foreigners. Think of the Chinese Boxer Rebellion. Again, the version you heard was told by Americans. That of Chinese boxers, a secret society, hoped to rid their country of foreigners. The methods they used were killing of Christian missionaries, killing of Chinese citizens who displayed aspects of European culture. Of course, we know the end result was a U.S.-led coalition to rid China of the boxers. The changing of society. We've also seen this, regime changes. Perhaps coup d'etats or the assassination of high-profile figures. Again, before we say that only the bad guys do it, we've engaged in that as well. The CIA helped to oust the leader of Iran and replace them with the Shah. The CIA helped to oust the leader of South Vietnam because he was doing some bad things. And so, while we like to paint terrorists as the bad guy, really it's just a tactic to achieve certain goals. These reasons often give rise to domestic terrorism. And that means that violence has been used by people to change the policies of their own government or overthrow their own government. Terrorism is not limited to post 9/11. In fact, the United States passed the Patriot Act during the 1960s, and that made it unlawful to meet or discuss any actions which might lead to the overthrowing of our government. Critics argued that it violated civil liberties. Proponents argued that there was a concern and fear that domestic terrorists might seek to overthrow our democratic style of government. However, you could also argue we are facing a new form of terror. And that is to achieve political ends or destroy what some consider to be forces of evil. Al-Qaeda has gathered supporters. ISIS has gathered followers, claiming they are engaged in a war of good versus evil. Another concern is that targets of these terrorist attacks are not limited to one particular country, but have been occurring all over the world. We have heard of attacks in Lebanon, in Syria, in Egypt, in Israel, in Brussels, in Paris, in Yemen, and I could go on. In the United States, even. All linked to terrorist organizations. And these groups have been and have displayed a willingness to use any type of weapon to kill their enemies, even the use of suicide, to ensure success. As we saw with the kamikaze warriors in the Second World War, someone willing to die to achieve destruction is almost impossible to stop. And of course, this brings us to September 11th, the most famous and destructive terrorist attack in American history. The weapons the terrorists used were planes loaded with fuel. And when driven into their targets, they became destructive missiles, just like the kamikaze planes of old. This attack showed the willingness of our enemies to hurt us by any means necessary. It also showed us the courage of our rescue workers. New York City's firefighters and police officers and rescue workers are a testament to the courage and selflessness of our people. Many of the very first firefighters on the scene rushed into these burning buildings without hesitation to do what they do to save as many as possible. And most all of them perished in the attempt. Meanwhile, firefighters worked around the clock to find as many survivors as possible, and sadly too few were found. There were survivors among the wreckage, but after so many days, these search efforts were transitioning into searches for bodies. People from around the country and world came to volunteer. Iron workers cut steel beams. High school students collected water and food. Donations of blood, food, and money were collected around the world.
Swiftly to restore American faith. In a speech to the entire nation, President Bush brought the country together in a common purpose to root out and destroy al-Qaeda and capture bin Laden. With that speech, President Bush and his advisors, Vice President Dick Cheney, Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, Secretary of State Colin Powell, and National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice, launched a response that would change how Americans lived, worked, played. First, the Bush administration changed how the nation viewed al-Qaeda. Under the Clinton administration, al-Qaeda was seen as a group of militants, at worst criminals. Bush changed the language. Al-Qaeda became an organization of terrorists with whom we were now at war.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
At home, action to fight this new war was swift. Security procedures were ramped up. Increased surveillance. Improved screenings. A Transportation Security Administration, responsible for security from airports to bus stations, was created. A color-coded alert system was enacted to warn the nation of the threat level posed by possible terrorist attacks. On October 26, 2001, at Bush's urging, Congress passed the controversial USA Patriot Act. The act increased the powers of police and the FBI to search telephone, email communications, medical, financial, and other records to seek out terrorists. And it expanded the role of the CIA and the National Security Administration in foreign intelligence gathering within the United States. Next, the United States took the war on terrorism to Afghanistan. In October 2001, American-led forces invaded, removed al-Qaeda, and ousted the Taliban regime, which had harbored the terrorists. By the end of the year, the Taliban and al-Qaeda were routed out of Afghanistan into the mountainous areas of neighboring Pakistan. But neither Osama bin Laden nor his top al-Qaeda leaders were ever captured. But the means taken to safeguard the nation ended up dividing the country. The Patriot Act and the torture of Islamic detainees turned many Americans against President Bush. America's efforts to destroy al-Qaeda and terrorist cells throughout the world may have been the reason there were no terrorist attacks in the United States from 2001 through 2008. But the nation, tired by war and mired in a recession, rejected George Bush and his policies by electing Democrat Barack Obama president in November 2008. At the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the conflict between Islamic militants and the U.S. had not been resolved.
If you've read or watched much about 9/11, you hear the word ground zero often. And this is the site of the disaster at the World Trade Center. As I said, work shifted to recovering bodies after a few days. Over 2 billion pounds of rubble were removed from the site. At this time, a new building has been constructed on the old site. It also includes a memorial and a cultural center, as well as the new Trade Center. As we saw in the clip, 9/11 has had a profound effect on American culture. People talk about a post-9/11 world. Some feel this has changed our lives. Whereas prior to 9/11, discussions of terrorists were thought to be something elsewhere. But 9/11 brought this home. In fact, post 9/11, there were numerous scares, such as the famous anthrax scare. This is a biological weapon that can be made into a powder and is effective enough that it can be placed in envelopes and mailed to office buildings. Letters containing this biological weapon were sent to members of the U.S. Congress in Washington, D.C. 5 were killed as a result of these attacks. But more importantly, people became concerned about aspects of their normal life, and that's the purpose of terrorism. People became afraid to open their mail. Yet no link between these letters and the attackers of 9/11 was ever found. But as I said, it increased Americans' fear. The United States responded, first by seeking to identify who was responsible for these attacks, and claiming responsibility for the September 11th attacks was Osama bin Laden. He was a member of the Saudi royal family. He was extremely wealthy, and he was using his wealth, power, and influence to direct the terrorists as part of the Al-Qaeda network. Their home base and training camps were located in Afghanistan. Afghanistan was ruled by a strict Islamic regime called the Taliban, or however you want to pronounce it. It was one tribe of many vying for control of this tribal region. The Taliban supported the terrorist group, and in return, bin Laden provided fighters. The response to the 9/11 attacks was a U.S.-led international coalition. Coalition stands for alliance or diverse group of many different nations. The goal was to fight terrorism and hunt down the Al-Qaeda network. One of our closest allies in this campaign was Great Britain, who played a prominent role. And while the Taliban refused to turn over bin Laden to the coalition, this led to a U.S.-directed invasion of Afghanistan, where the United States and many other nations as part of this alliance converged on Afghanistan, and we are still involved in operations there today.
Another factor that drives a wedge in public opinion is the nation's position in the world order. The country's interventionist foreign policy troubles many Americans.
When you're looking at a particular problem, as to whether or not you intervene, you must look at the principles and values that are at risk. But you also have to look and see if there's a national interest. Because if you go in there and you start spending a lot of the taxpayers' money, and particularly if you start taking casualties, the American people won't support it for very long, and you cannot sustain a foreign policy that does not have sufficient domestic political support.
Many non-industrialized nations resent the intrusion of the industrialized West on any level. Their reasons are religious and cultural, as well as economic.
In much of the world, the United States is viewed as arrogant, materialistic, inflated, and ultimately out of touch with the values of other nations. The fact that American goods are ubiquitous in all parts of the world, the fact that Americans seem to value a kind of materialistic society, the resentment of the huge amounts of the natural resources of the world that we use when other people don't have access to them. And all of that creates frictions and tensions, not just in the Islamic world, but in the larger world as well.
Even though globalization isn't imperial in the traditional sense, I think many people understand that it is still very unjust in terms of the way that it distributes the benefits of the global economy to various societies. Some people are not getting a fair shake, and in fact the system operates preferentially in such a way that there is almost nothing that some societies can actually do economically, even with the best intentions and with the most honest administration, to better their condition.
I think the United States has to figure out how to operate in both the post-Vietnam world and the post-9/11 world to play an active, engaged role and not to simply be the focus of the resentment because of American materialism and American arrogance and American unwillingness to sort of function in a more open way with the rest of the world.
Before September 11th, 2001, Americans thought of terrorism as a problem that plagued other nations, certainly not their home country.
The United States historically has been a country that has been protected by the two oceans and has never really experienced anything quite like this. President Bush said shortly after September 11th that the fight against terrorism was the defining mission of his administration.
This is a long-term battle, war. There'll be battles, but this is long-term. After all, our mission is not just Osama bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda organization. Our mission is to battle terrorism. Good morning.
In 2002, the Bush administration seeks to define the threat and the country's response to it in a document called the National Security Strategy of the United States.
Some of the ideas in it are already very controversial. And I'm not taking a stand on which side is right, but I do want to note the significance of the issues and the debate that's going with that. We have redefined what national security means geographically. Second, it's being redefined as a function of time. For all of our history, the great threats to our security took time to emerge. You could see them, you could react. Well, now the threats are emerging from groups that can wield destructive powers that hitherto were only available to states. And the third great redefinition is the new role values are playing in the redefinition of our national security. The Bush administration, it's willing to make judgments about whether nations are good or bad, whether they're on the right path or the wrong path. Why? Because the future conflicts are more within societies than they are between them. The arguments about the future of the Muslim world will be resolved inside those countries by people deciding whether they will embrace a pluralistic vision or an apocalyptic vision of a single creed, swallowing up or destroying all other competitors. For America to engage and lead, it must be willing to make hard and unpopular judgments, inconvenient judgments, about whether countries are on the right path or the wrong path. And these are the kinds of issues our country is going to have to debate in the years ahead.
Historians are not by nature predictive, but most imagine that the new era will continue to be fraught with uncertainty.
Uncertainty can be incredibly debilitating because people don't know whether if I open that next letter, is it going to contain anthrax spores? If I go into the subway, is it going to blow up? If I go to work, is someone going to crash an airliner into it? And the hope is that that will sort of work on people's resolve and they will get tired. And that is sort of the invidious part of terrorism. And it presents governments with a real daunting challenge.
It's an enemy that likes to hide and burrow in, and their network is extensive. There's no rules.
I think we have to understand that policymakers operate in this haze of uncertainty in the modern world, in which it's almost impossible to predict what is going to happen at any given time. So if you take a look at Bush's brief speech giving Saddam Hussein 48 hours to get out of town, he gives the rationale for the United States going to war against Iraq and its weapons of mass destruction. And he says specifically in that speech that these weapons may not be used. We don't know that they will be used. It's possible that they will be used, but we have to do it anyway because we can't tolerate the uncertainty.
Uncertainty, and yet the events that the country has endured these last few years reflect the great courage and faith of its people, faith in the ideals upon which this country was founded, and in the determination of committed men and women to work toward a more just future in this unfinished nation.
So a little about the war in Afghanistan. It was codenamed Operation Enduring Freedom. It involved the bombing of Taliban air defenses, the destruction of airfields, the destruction of command centers, as well as Al-Qaeda training camps. In fact, within months, the coalition had driven the Taliban from power. Osama bin Laden was not found until much later, in fact, nearly a decade later. And I believe it was in within the past 5 years, I want to say 2011, but I don't remember exactly, that Osama bin Laden was located in a compound in Pakistan. And President Obama ordered SEAL Team 6 to go into Afghanistan using his executive powers to send troops anywhere within the world without telling anyone. And then very soon the President announced that we have killed Osama bin Laden. But yet he was not found in Afghanistan during the war. This led to a great deal of embarrassment and frustration. But meanwhile, an interim Afghan government was established to replace the Taliban. Now, the Department of Homeland Security was a new cabinet-level position established to coordinate and analyze threats, to guard the nation's borders, as well as airports, and to lead and direct any type of response to attacks on our soil. Also established was the Homeland Security Advisory System. They used a, quote, threat of conditions to advise the public about the level of terrorist threats, and this provided guidelines for response during a period of heightened alert. Also, the goal of Homeland Security has been to search for terrorists in the United States. Al-Qaeda cells operating within our country's borders were known as sleeper cells. Sleepers are agents who enter a country. The purpose is to blend into a community, to look just like you or I, to conduct normal lives, to play baseball, major in college, go to work, have kids, go to church, and then when called upon, to commit terrorist acts. Meanwhile, U.S. officials detained and questioned numerous Arabs and other Muslims who behaved suspiciously or who violated immigration restrictions. What we're looking at here is a photograph of Tom Ridge, the Secretary of the new Department of Homeland Security, as he was introducing the new color-coded threat advisory system. Another response of the terrorist attacks has been the USA Patriot Act. The law allowed the government to detain foreigners suspected of terrorism for up to 7 days without any formal charge of a crime. It authorizes the government to tap all phones used by suspects and monitor their email and internet use. It makes search warrants valid across all states. That if the Department of Homeland Security has a warrant for the arrest of a suspected terrorist, they can flee nowhere within the borders of the United States. All U.S. banks are ordered to investigate sources of large foreign accounts. And terrorists can be prosecuted for crimes without any time restriction or limitation. Essentially, this allows the U.S. government to violate normal due process and habeas corpus in the search for terrorists. Critics of this claim that detaining these people is a violation of U.S. civil rights. The government's response has been to argue that limiting civil liberties during wartime to protect national security is not unusual. And to be fair, it's not. As we've seen in every single war, the U.S. government has been involved in limiting the civil liberties of our own people.
Americans are safer today than they were 2 years ago. And America is freer today than at any time in the history of human freedom.
Many supporters of the Patriot Act argue that old rules no longer apply.
9/11 gave us a new world. It was a world that said, well, some of the walls that we built comfortably, unexceptionally, between intelligence and law enforcement were sustainable at a time when we didn't need for those two communities to talk to each other, but are not sustainable now.
Even before September 11th, plenty of people had identified the problem that we couldn't share what we knew from the criminal justice system with what we knew from the intelligence side. A terrible flaw, fatal flaw almost. So you had this really absurd situation where, knowing how dangerous al-Qaeda was, we still couldn't pool what we knew from the two halves of our brain. It was like a lobotomized government.
The USA Patriot Act relaxed the legal prohibitions so that the two communities can work together to coordinate information and collaborate activities. This is a critical step in order to allow all hands who are called on deck to fight terrorism to share the information from the left hand and the right hand. It is a critical step, but it is also a constitutional step.
This is perhaps the most respectful law that relates to the liberty and freedom of the American people that's ever been passed.
When Mr. Ashcroft rewrote the FBI guidelines, specifically says that an FBI agent on his or her own initiative at the local level, with no oversight from headquarters, can follow you into your house of worship, can follow you into your political meeting without any indication that you are involved in criminal wrongdoing. Why is it that anybody should be spied on in their church, in their synagogue, in their mosque, in their political meeting if what they are doing is exercising their constitutional rights and liberties? That's wrong. And it is a throwback to a much uglier and more dangerous period of time.
The issues that we're talking about here today, involving not just the Patriot Act, but the whole range of new government powers.
The famous or infamous Patriot Act, in fact, has Congress's own admonition on this score that even the library inquiries that hypothetically could be made cannot be made for purposes of suppressing First Amendment protected activities. That's explicit in the statute.
You actually have to go to a judge to convince him that this information is relevant to a national security investigation against a spy or a terrorist. And the FBI has to, every 6 months, report to Congress how many times it has used the provision and under what circumstances.
The granting of these warrants under Section 215 for the seizure of records, the language of the Patriot Act says, you will do this. It is totally unclear by what process a judge even has the right to ask questions, to demand more information. It is an instruction to the judge to grant this. And this raises tremendous questions about the independence and the power of the judiciary to act as a counterbalance.
And so post 9/11, aviation security has been heightened. National Guard troops are used to patrol airports. U.S. Sky Marshals are assigned to airplanes. They are the only people authorized to carry firearms on board an airplane. Bars are installed on cockpit doors to prevent hijackers from taking control of planes. The 9/11 hijackers were able to storm into the cockpit where the pilots were. Better locks have been placed on doors, protecting the pilots of planes. The Aviation and Transportation Security Act makes airport security the responsibility of the federal government. Federal officials are authorized to inspect airline passengers as well as carry on bags. This has created long delays in airports, and critics have claimed this has resulted in invasions of privacy. And so, as you saw in the clip, this has led to a debate over the balance of national security and our civil liberties.